Dr. Shapiro is co-founder and executive director of Animals and Society Institute. He's the editor of Society and Animals, the Journal of Human Animal Studies. He's co-editor of the Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science. He directs the ASI Anti-Care Program, a psychological assessment and treatment approach for juveniles and adults who abuse animals. After earning his BA from Harvard in American Studies and a PhD in clinical and personality psychology, Dr. Shapiro has taught in the psych department at Bates College in Lewiston. He's the author of 3 books, most recently Animal Models and Human Psychology. Dr. Shapiro will provide a perspective from outside the zoo world, and I look forward to it. Dr. Shapiro.
Thank you. Thank you. So, thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. Great opportunity to be here. I appreciate it. Let me say just a word about Animals and Society Institute. It is a think tank. We have focused on trying to develop the field of human-animal studies, or anthrozoology, or animal studies, as it's variously called. We also have focused on dealing with the problem of animal abuse, largely in a home setting, a domestic animal setting. So we have developed a treatment approach for working with people who abuse animals. We're also working with the criminal justice system to try to get them to take animal abuse seriously. So I'm an academic and an advocate. I started Animals and Society Institute, or its predecessor, 30 years ago. I'm not a zoo person, and I'm going to read my paper in a second, but I just wanted to start with a personal experience, since my paper will be somewhat intellectual. I did have a personal experience. In fact, it was at the Detroit Zoo a week or 2 ago, and I just want to share it because I don't quite understand it, and you folks perhaps can help me understand it, or perhaps my paper is an explication of it in a cerebral way, which is how I deal with emotional problems. But anyway, I went to the giraffe exhibit, and we sort of went behind the counter, and there were 3 giraffes there, 2 female and a male, I believe, and there were several keepers there, and it was obvious that the caretakers were very, very attached to these animals. Vice versa, I don't know, but presumably so. And they fed these animals while we were there with crackers and so forth. And then I noticed that the space was somewhat small. They were indoors. The outdoors looked also pretty small. So that's what I saw, at least. But anyway, what happened was that as we were about to leave, I looked at the male giraffe, and I think he looked at me, maybe not. And I looked at him for, maybe 30 seconds or 60 seconds, and then I walked out, and I totally choked up and teared up. And I just stayed that way for minutes. And this is a very unusual experience for me. I'm a fairly controlled guy and so forth. But anyway, I had that experience. So, just a couple of slides. So this is simply, I just went through a bunch of books, as academics do, and I pulled out all the terms that seem to refer to wildlife institutions. I'm using institutions in a very, very broad sense. So you can see something like ecotourism is an institution, if you will. But just glance at those. So I studied those, and then I pulled out of them and changed some of them and so forth, and I came up with this diagram, which is going to be the center of the talk, but I'm going to, I'll explicate it. You can see on the top right there's a key. I'll explain those terms. You can see on the top is Earth Trust, which is sort of a very animal-centered kind of place, a preserve. And the very bottom is the urban zoo. And when I refer to zoo, I'm going to be talking about the urban zoo. I'm not going to be talking about Kruger or the wildlife park, although those might begin to blur and blend, as we'll see. So, the title of the talk is Decentralizing Functions, the Proliferation of Institutional Forms. Obviously, what I mean by that is that I'm going to talk about the contemporary zoo and its functions. And then I'm going to talk about what I think the future zoo should have as functions. I think it'll give up some of the current functions and gain some others. And there'll be other institutions that will develop which will be we can call them zoos, but they won't be like the contemporary zoo. They'll pick up some of those functions. So that's the thesis, okay? Through their long history, zoos have evolved such that today they have many functions: entertainment, education, conservation, contact or encounter with living wild animals, research, welfare. In the past few decades, we have seen an acceleration of critical studies of urban-based zoos that address empirically the degree to which these functions are being met. I suggest that in 50 years, I picked 50 years, I couldn't do 100, these functions and others not clear yet to us will be fulfilled by an array of its distinct institutions, each of which will have preferred locations in a spectrum of places ranging from the human-centered city to the animal-centered wilderness on the top there. I present such an array together with a set of framing concepts. The concepts are reductionism, blurred boundaries, and sovereignty. With regard to the future of the zoo, the take-home is that the contemporary urban-based zoo will be barely recognized, having significantly different functions. We all share at least two goals with respect to wildlife: stopping human-induced extinctions and building up sustainable populations of non-captive, endangered, and threatened species. We want ourselves and our progeny to live alongside a thriving and diverse natural world. I take this as the broader frame within which we ask, what is the future of zoos? Any discussion of the future of zoos must engage practical, scientific, and value-based concerns. Here I bracket the practical and technical issues of how we get from here to there, starting with what we want the future world to look like and thinking backwards from there to here. It is helpful to take this perspective because the status quo as a starting point is a mixed bag. It promotes realistic and practical solutions, but it also narrows options, biases us toward the status quo, depends on current technology and vested interests. Which of the several functions of contemporary zoos are being fulfilled well and which are not, which are appropriate and which are better fulfilled by other institutions? We will be discussing and evaluating these questions in this symposium, but I raise a prior question. Why burden one institution with so many disparate functions? By analogy, increasingly people argue that the contemporary university is not viable because it is impractical and inefficient for one kind of institution to provide the universe of education-related functions. So let's look at the world 50 years down the road that fulfills the several functions of the contemporary zoo without assuming that any one institution best carries that burden. For example, what would a world look like that allowed some viable populations of wild animals to live in relatively natural habitats and, on the human side, provided for some connection for us to that natural world, to some form of human-animal relationships that satisfied our biophilia? Proposed schema is an adaptation of Mary Midgley's concept of mixed communities, a set of concentric circles of spaces occupied by different arrangements of life and varieties of human-animal relationships. Several concepts undergird the scheme. The first, reductionism. So reductionism refuses to take something as less than it is. Excuse me, it refers to taking something as less than it is. The classic example is reducing subjectivity, or experience, or mental process, to physiology and behavior. In behavior in the minimalistic sense of behavioristic psychology. Excuse me. So for examples of reductionism, farm animals are objectified as meat on the hoof, product, commodity, and live truncated and deprived lives. Lab animals are de-individuated, reduced to data points, psychological or physiological part processes, grossly, behaviorally, and physiologically manipulated, not themselves anymore, but models of us. Zoo animals are reduced to objects of entertainment and education. Within the recently acquired conservation function of the zoo, animals are extensions of the overall signage of the conservation message. A map of former compared to present range, a brief description of habits and habitat, and the exhibit proper, a mixed natural artificial habitat. The animals are reduced to pointers to that larger ecological context. They are not seen as individual animals living the life that they actually are living in the zoo. This is from spotty semiotic analysis. Regarding zoo animals, some argue that a lion in a cage is not a lion. That part of being a lion, of lionness, is living in lion country. And we had the discussion before whether we can recreate lion country in the urban zoo. I don't think we can. More generally, I don't think we should. More generally, it is suggested that individuals of most non-human species of animals are more dependent on a particular environment to be what they are. Lion country makes the lion. When we take lions from the wild and when we breed them outside of lion country, we literally create zoo lions. If we cannot sustain lionness in the zoo, the urban zoo, what would it mean if we introduced these zoo animals into the wild? Might it not have the opposite of the intended consequence, replacing truly wild animals with a hybridized species, the lion zoo wild? Is this an inherent limitation contradiction in the present use of urban zoo as a site of conservation and research? Is this a contradiction? This gets me to the second category, the second concept. This contradiction assumes that there is a clear and discrete categorical distinction between captive and free. So here I invoke the discourse of postmodernism, a tenet of which is that such neat categorical distinctions do not obtain, and that the categories must be deconstructed. The contemporary world is already much messier, and the future world will be messier still. We see it in the falling away of cultural stereotypes that sustain distinctions between genders. Iconically, in the increasingly porous boundary that allows Andrea to become Andy with some chemicals and some strokes of the knife, and generally in the increasing acceptance of gender fluidity, same-sex parents, what happened to mom and dad, so forth. More germane to the present topic, we see the blur between human-animal, a foundational categorical distinction in Western civilization under which are subsumed other major correlative categories such as culture-nature and reason-instinct. Under the critical eye of postmodernism and other intellectual developments such as cognitive ethology and comparative neuroscience, these traditional us-them categorical cleavers have been considerably dulled. For other animals, use tools, produce and pass on innovations, form relationships, grieve their loss, make war, and sustain peace. They not only have their own culture and society, they in significant ways co-constitute our own. In the other direction, arguably, all so-called nature, now and increasingly in the future, will be hybrid nature. That's from Bulbeck. The contemporary zoo with its several functions are both influenced by and influence these boundary crossings and hybridizations. Animal and human interactions, the line between captive, free, tame, wild become less clear. So in the schema, we replace a framework based on discrete categorical distinctions, wild, tame, domesticated, so forth, with situated descriptions, accounts of particular institutions in particular places. We describe the institutions and their denizens in each sphere, open to the likelihood that the several typical categories will not cleanly obtain: captive, free, wild, tame, zoo animals, park animals, feral animals, etc. The schema attempts to distinguish between and meet the needs of both humans and other animals. It particularly takes on the importance for humans of having human-animal relationships, of forming companionate relationships, as well as maintaining a sense of being related to a world that is partly natural, a natural world, a la biophilia again. So the schema provides both integrated human, animal, and segregated places, of course, both only relatively achieved and both in flux. The third concept, then, is sovereignty. I'm explicating those concepts up there in the top right. Sovereignty refers to the role historically that power and governance has had in the construction of the world by humans. As we have colonized other human communities, so we have colonized animals. Since 1900, we have occupied and exploited lands of other animals, decreasing wild animal populations by 1/3. That's from Donaldson and Kimlicka. With the recognition of the capabilities and needs of other animals to exercise agency, autonomy, and control, institutions in the future will be developed that give them some measure of sovereignty in their lives. Earth trust is a term that's I just noticed for the first time. It's the wild. It's diminished in size. It's for animals only, if you will. It's large tracts of lands that make disproportionate contribution to ecology and wildlife. I'm talking about the future now. It's connected to other areas via wildlife corridors. It's bounded by buffer green areas. It's often built on existing national and regional parks. It's surrounded by locally owned small businesses and cottage industries. In terms of the functions of the zoo, reductionism, minimal. That is, the animal is itself. It's its own being. It's got agency and so forth. Minimal reductionism. Sovereignty, again, high for the animal. It would be non-interventionist. We wouldn't try to save animals there who are in trouble. Local extinction would be a natural phenomenon. In terms of human-animal relationships, no direct human-animal relationships. Entertainment, education, vicarious only, indirect. Conservation, it would be a habitat preservation area. It would have that function. By the way, this whole set here, I was told not to walk.
No walking.
No walking. This whole set here is a very large area. There would be many of these sets globally. Okay, so there would be an earth trust, a reserve, a protected area, a park, so what, concentric circles going out all the way down to the urban zoo, which would be located in this urban city, which will have 10 million people, generally, in 50 years. So the second one, reserve, public access by foot only. So this is a free-ranging place for wild animals, no hunting or trapping. Reductionism, again, is very minimal. Sovereignty is high for the animals. Human-animal relationships, yeah, high, but again, you know, you're walking through this area. How often do you see an animal? Not that often, but, you know, we could argue that it's a high education experience. It's certainly an immersion experience. Conservation, major research and in situ reintroduction sites. So this is a major point that I want to make, that this would be the site, this and one or two other places here, would be the site, the primary site of conservation research and reintroduction, rather than this urban zoo with 10 million people around it and trying to, right. That's a major point that I want to try to make, and it's a point that others will make as well, and I guess there's a whole talk on that. The protected area, it's drive-through. Okay, so it's this safari kind of. Again, free-ranging, limited provisioning of animals, so you'd have a better opportunity to see stuff. Again, no hunting and trapping. Functions, reductionism is moderate. The animal is in some ways becoming tamed, controlled, coming to a feeding area, and so forth. Becoming like a park animal, but not quite a park animal. You know what I mean by a park animal, right? Okay. Sovereignty is mixed. They have some control of their human-animal relationships, observation only, entertainment, moderate, etc. So then the park, number 4 here, ad lib provisioning. Again, free-ranging, public access for recreation, camping, and so forth. So we're beginning to bring in the human element a little bit more directly. Reductionism is significant, for these are partially tame animals. They're self-selecting for tameness and so forth. They're park animals. The sovereignty, it's compromised for the animals. They have less control. High interaction with wild animals in terms of the human-animal relationship, ecotourism. Conservation would be a function to build up populations of selected species of animals appropriate for human encounters. I'm thinking of the Monkey Park. Book just came out on that by Knight, Monkey Park in Japan. So then the sanctuary, you know what that is, a large confined area, selected species of large animals like the elephant. So I'll stop there. Rehabilitation center is pretty clear. Right now I'm going to go back to describing these two, and I'm going to go back to my text, because that's where I want to be careful in what I say. So the subtitle here is The Future of Zoos, the Place of Wildlife in Cities. Curation of the zoo of the future focuses on local or endemic species rather than exotics. Smaller numbers of species and species with smaller individuals such as insects, amphibians, rodents, invertebrates, birds. Animal populations are maintained largely through rescue and rehabilitation rather than captive breeding. So this in a way is a new or emerging function for the zoo, that it is a sanctuary-like. It's a rescue rehabilitation place. That's where the animals come from. Exhibition architecture and caretaking emphasize individual welfare. That's going to be discussed. And particularly, and here I want to add this, agency. I want you to think about that concept. The opportunity to maintain species-specific levels of activity and to control and shape their environment. For example, animals are provided with materials with which they can design, build, maintain, rebuild, and refashion their own living space. They have a high degree of sovereignty over the space and minimal reduction in their species-specific experience of the world. Where possible, individuals of compatible species share living space. At the same time, animals are allowed to become zoo animals, both through natural selection and cultural transmission, blurring the wild-tame distinction. Again, hybridized nature, zoo animals, we had a little discussion about that. The future urban zoo de-emphasizes the conservation function, as these are largely assumed by in situ institutions such as those I described a moment ago. However, the zoo does contribute to enhance the sustainable living for endemic animals, some of whom may be endangered. On the human side, where it is empirically demonstrated to be consistent with the welfare of the animals, the zoo, along with several other institutions, helps meet the human needs for recreation and education. And I might add, empirically demonstrated to truly be educational. This is a problem, and we really need empirical studies that demonstrate in what ways zoos are really educational. Part of the educational role is a broader cultural, values in inculcating, I'm sorry, I have a mistake here in the text, inculcating values about the importance of animals and the environment, educating them about ecology and so forth. The architecture of exhibits facilitates interactions between humans and animals. The form and shape of the interaction is co-constituted as the animals have the option to participate in the right to privacy. To deepen the human side of the interactions and compensate for the typical over-reliance on the visual, provision is made for contact to include the other senses, tactile, olfactory, auditory, kinetic. We've discussed that a little bit and whether or not that can be done in a tech way rather than directly. Also, there is an emphasis on gaining access to viewing the world from the animal's perspective. People have talked about the importance of that. This latter is supplemented by enhanced technologies such as the 3D video, the simulators at the Detroit Zoo, and stuff we cannot yet imagine. Just think of 50 years from now what technology, we have no idea what it's going to be. The brief relationship with a here and now animal has the additional effect of satisfying the human need for connectedness and relationship to nature and can be a vehicle for a strong conservation measure. However, part of the message is helping the public to recognize and appreciate that the animals at the zoo are zoo animals, a form of hybrid nature, that a trip to the zoo is not a vicarious wilderness trip. Outside of the zoo, the urban landscape augments the zoo experience. Outside of the zoo, the urban landscape augments the zoo experience. Counteracting the dramatic conquest of animal-occupied land since 1900, multiplying human populations and decreasing animal population by 1/3, the city has been redesigned to become a zoopolis. This is from Welch. Renaturalized or regreened, the predominantly human-centered space is increasingly shared with other animals, rabbits, deer, fox, coyote, raccoon, possum, owl, peregrine. The zoopolis is a complex set of arrangements which humans and other animals cohabitate. Beyond the shibboleths of humane treatment and welfare, humans have contextually contingent, extensive, and positive duties to wildlife. The zoopolis provides habitat for local wildlife, wildlife corridors, highways with overpasses for animals, human residential landscaping designed as wildlife habitat, the garden, grasses, not lawns, hedgerows. Regional landscape scale planning allows wild animals to flourish in the city, and I refer to the newly emerging field of inventionist ethology. This is from Acampora. This creates further human-animal interactions facilitated by technology, and this piece here, zoo backwards, ooze. Acampora gives a couple of examples. One is that the wild animals have a presence and standing to the mutual benefit of both. He gives an example of geese, where you can call them electronically, and they come, and they respond to you, and stuff like that, where you begin to get a somewhat virtual, mixed technological interaction with, pardon me? 3 minutes? Okay, I'm virtually done. In the Netherlands, here's my description. Humans can direct artificial geese by remote control and have them swim toward and vocalize at actual geese, whose own reactions can in turn be watched via computerized video cameras. Strange. Another example would be a habitat created on top of a building where birds come and so forth. And that scene could be seen by webcam and all that as well. So, complementing the separation in the animal-centered zones, the Earth Trust Preserve, the Reserve, and the Safari Park, here integration is featured, not separation. This is a tension that we need to discuss, whether in helping wild animals we're going to separate them from us or bring them closer to us. Bringing them closer to us, of course, allows us to appreciate them and have important relationships, and values spring from that and so forth. But separation may be more in their interest. So that's why we need a set of institutions, some of which advantage separation and some of which advantage integration. So in this formally, grossly human-centered environment, the city, and the suburbs, wild animals have presence and standing to the mutual benefit of both. From a historical perspective, this is a form of compensation for human colonization of wildlife territory. In the zoopolis, domesticated, feral, wild animals, zoo animals, captive and free, tame and wild, all are blurred as individuals share space and sovereignty, all permeable and in flux, all self-determining. In the city and zoo of the future, humans are no longer the only political animal. Reference to Aristotle. Thank you very much.